Good morning. This is the second video in the gown construction series of videos that I'm doing on building an 18th century gown. The last episode we did the pleating on the back panel of the gown to the lining. Prior to that, you can see videos on draping your own pattern and taking that draping and making a paper pattern out of it. In this video, I'm going to continue on with gown construction by adding the front bodice pieces to the gown and the skirt bodice, or the skirt pieces to the gown. My name is Kelly Grant. I am proprietress of Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So, after the last video, I prepared my skirt panels. There's two of them here, and I gave them a good press so that they'll be nice and flat to sew the seams. I also cut out my lining and my fashion fabric for my front bodice pieces. And what I did on the lining pieces was based through my stitching line to the right side. It's very difficult to see because I used white thread on a light colored fabric, but all of my sewing lines have now been transferred to the right side so I can see what I'm working with. And now I'm going to lay the wrong sides together, and I'm going to baste the two pieces together. And I'm just using regular old machine thread. Glasses help because I'm going blind. I don't waste my linen thread on basting. I just use regular old machine thread. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to baste right at the edge. I'm going to baste in the body because I want to have room to then fold these edges in. And I'm just using a diagonal baste, and I'm picking up the two layers. Just doing a back stitch to start. So I've gone all the way around the outside. And now these two pieces are attached. The next thing I'm going to do on the front edge and on the side seam edge is I'm going to fold underneath my seam allowance on that stitching line. And here's why I wanted to have that basted in place, so I knew where my stitching line is. And you have to be careful to not pull these seams. You're just folding under very carefully because they're on the bias. You could easily pull them out. And I'm picking up the iron as I move it across. I'm not pushing the iron across. And on the fashion layer, I want just a little bit of an overlap on the fold, just a hair. And there, now both pieces are done, ready to go. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, grab my pins. I'm going to fold that lining out of the way, and I'm going to match up my fold line of my fashion fabric with my basting line of the back that shows me where I need to stitch. And I'm going to pin those layers together. And this seam may or may not lay flat, depending on the human being you're making the gown for, depending on how curvy they are. And I'm not going all the way to the end, because I'm not going to stitch all the way to the end, because I want the ability to be able to fold up the bottom edge of the gown to accommodate the pleats of the skirt. So I'm going to go ahead and pin both sides, and then we'll come back and do a bit of a close-up shot of the stitch that I'm going to use, which is the same stitch as what I did on the back. Okay, so both sides are pinned now and ready to stitch. I'm keeping my lining out of the way. I'm coming up underneath the fashion fabric with my knot. I'm going to tuck that in place. I have my fingers underneath the fabric to hold it in place, and I'm stitching through 3 layers right now. And I'm doing a little back stitch. So that's one side seam done, and I'm going to go ahead and do the other side seam in the same way. And I'm going to move the fabric around so that it's easier for me to hold, easier for me to sew. And again, hiding my knots. And I had just enough thread. I'm going to go back to the underside and make my knot. And then I'm going to leave a tail. Again, I did not go all the way to the end of that seam. That's so that I can then fold up the pleat, or the bodice rather, to accommodate the pleats for the skirt. And I have stitched through 3 layers on the back, so 2 fashion layers and the lining, but the lining on the front is just left hanging free. And that'll be caught up later. The next thing I'm going to do is sew the skirt side panels to the back panel, and I'm just going to use a running stitch for that. Right sides together, running stitch with the odd back stitch just to secure things. You could also do it by machine if you wanted to. It's a straightforward seam. Make sure that your stitching is nice and even, and press your seam allowance open when you're done the seam. So that's what I'm going to tackle next. I am going to make sure that all of my motifs are going in the same direction, because I'm smart. That's about all the pattern matching I do when I'm making a historical gown like this, though. I tend not to worry about pattern matching unless it's a plaid, say across the front of a pair of men's breeches. Fabric was fairly expensive for most of human history. It's only gotten cheap in the last 100 years or so. And so we would do the most economically cutting possible, and pattern matching wasn't a thing. If it happens on a garment that I'm making by fluke, it is usually by fluke. Yeah, I don't worry about it. And yes, I use pins. Don't have quite enough thread to do the whole seam, so I'm going to knot it off and start a new thread. want to be sure to sew all the way to the end of the seam. And at the end of the seam, I'm going to do another little back stitch and make my knot. And now I'm going to press my seam open. And I'm going to use my little pressing tool here because it's easier to slide underneath than wrestle with all this fabric. So there's my seam all nice and pressed open. The stitching is nice and tight. I'm not seeing any holes in the seam. And that's done. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side and press that open and get it ready for pleating into the bodice. So I've got the other skirt panel stitched on now, and all of the skirt panels are on. I've determined where I want to put my pocket slits. They're not going to sit right on the seam. So what I've done is I've slashed the cotton, folded both skirt panels and slashed the cotton, and now I'm going to roll hem. And to roll a hem, I'm going to make the tiniest little fold I can and just finger press it. Hiding my knot. I'm going to hide the tail in there too. And now I'm going to work little 7 stitches. And you'll see what I mean in a second once I get a couple stitches made. So I'm going to take a stitch in the body and a stitch on the fold. And see how it makes a little 7? Backward 7. Or I guess no, it's a frontward 7, isn't it? Another little 7. And then once I've got a whole row of them like that, I'm going to very carefully pull it up tight so that it rolls. And the smaller your first fold is, the smaller the rolled hem will be. And that'll be determined by your quality of your fabric. And it looks like I'm making a snarled mess, but I'm making sure that my threads are not crossing over. Okay, so I'm going to finish the pocket openings and then I'll be back. Okay, now that the skirts are on and the pocket slits are hemmed, I'm just going to ignore them for a little while. They're just going to hang out over there on my ironing board, not doing anything. Out of the way. And I'm going to finish off this front bodice. Yes, I could have done it, most of it earlier, but it just felt like it made sense at this point in my head. So I'm going to fell along the front edge. This is the edge that comes down along the front of the stomacher to the front point, and then I'm going to stitch the two pieces together along the hip edge as well. And that's going to give me something to work with that will be able to support the weight of the skirts when I pleat them in. I'm also going to encase my back side back seam with, and I'm just going to whip stitch that down, being careful not to go through to the front side. So I'm going to take a few minutes and do that. So I've hidden my knot in my thread, just like I mentioned there. And I'm going to go through and prick the outside. I'm using my finger as a guide. And then I'm going to come up back and pick up the fold of the lining. And that's going to make that little tiny top stitch that you see on the outside of garments. But it's also going to nail your lining in place. With a sewing machine, this is a 3-step process where you seam it right sides together, and then you sew your seam allowances to one side, and then you top stitch. But this stitch does it all in one seam. Just going to tuck my basting thread in there. And that's what it looks like on the outside. My stitches could be a little bit neater, but I'm not terribly worried about that. So that's what the front edge will look like on the outside. And that's what it looks like on the inside. And I'm going to go down the front edge to the point, and then back along the hip, and then I'm going to whip stitch this seam. Trying not to straighten myself. So I'll finish this seam and I'll be back in a minute. Remember to knot your thread and hide the end of your thread in between the seam if you can, so that the knot and the tail are not hanging around being ugly on the inside. Good morning. Welcome back to the studio. So yesterday I finished off the front edge and the hip line edge of the bodices, or the bodice fronts. This is done so that you have a nice strong edge to sew your pleats to along the hip line. I also decided where I wanted to have the pocket slits. I want them to be in a comfortable spot, much like where your pockets are on your favorite sweater. So I want them in line with that line on the body, and I marked balance points on both bodice fronts. The pocket slits are nice and large to be able to access easily. Because it's cotton and tears easily, I finished the bottom edge with a row of buttonhole stitches around the bottom of the cut, and about a centimeter up from the bottom of the cut I worked a bar tack to prevent that opening from opening up entirely and having a slash in her skirt. So I'm going to start at that balance point where I want my pocket slits and work my pleats so that they do this around the body to that pocket slit. And you'll be able to notice it on your cutting diagram, which I have right here behind me. I always have Janet Arnold or one of the other books with patterns in it open as I'm working so that I can go back and reference it throughout the process. Glasses. I've also put the center front of the gown perpendicular to the bottom of my ironing board. I'm going to use that as a reference point so that the fronts of the skirt hang appropriately. And I'm going to come up enough so that I have enough clearance to get over that high hip. And I'm just going to pin the center front to the center front in a couple of spots to make sure that it's well nailed down for now. And then I'm going to put my pocket slits in the right spot. And I'm really going to take my time with this step. It may look like it's an easy thing for me to do, and that it should be easy for you to do as well, but with all things garment construction, practice makes perfect, and I have practiced quite a bit. Okay, so my pleats are about 1 inch deep. That's a good first joint of your thumb. So I'm just going to pin my pleats in place. And I'm not trying to match patterns or make stripes line up or anything like that. I'm just pleating. I'm not even looking at the pattern on the fabric. And I'm going to work slightly downwards towards the center back so that I will be in line with the pleats that I did the other day on the back panel. And I was able to hide that side back seam. Always fun. Now I'm going to work the front. In the front, the pleats are going to go backwards towards the pocket opening. So the pocket opening is, in effect, a box pleat. And I need to make these pleats a little deeper to get all the way in. So I'm just going to pick them up and move them slightly. Take as much time as you need to with this so that you're happy with the finished product. There we go. Now I'm going to do the same on the other side. Once you've got all of the pleats pleated and stuck to the board and you're happy with how they look, very carefully lift the pleat up, unpinning it from the board and pinning just the pleats. This is done so that you can then take the bodice and put it on top of the pleats, just to double check everything. You could also baste these pleats with diagonal bastes if you wish, but I just use straight pins. And I'm literally just working my way along, unpinning from the board and pinning the pleat. And I'm working in such a way across the board that when I do pick up the pleats, everything is going to stay where I want it to. Even that last one that looks like it's going to be fussy is going to work perfectly once the tops of the pleats are flipped down. And I haven't hemmed my front edge of my skirt just yet, and that's so that I can futz with it a little bit more if I need to. So yeah, I can pick up that whole stack of pleats just like that. But now, more importantly, I can also pick up the whole bodice just like that. And I'm going to just carefully pin the pleats into the board just there so that they're not going to move. And I'm going to double check that I'm happy with how the pleats are sitting against the bodice. Now I'm very carefully going to pin the hip edge, that curve, to the pleats where I want them to sit. Be careful not to pin the ironing board, because I want to be able to pick things up. And I don't need to pin each individual pleat because they're already pinned. I just need to pin enough that I can pick the whole thing up. Now I'm going to pull out those 2 pins pinning everything to the board. And now I can pick up the gown and be able to sew those pleats in place. So that's kind of what it looks like on the inside. And all of those pins will stay in place until I get that hip edge stitched. And I'm just going to use a felling stitch again. This time it'll be worked from the outside, so it'll be more like a slip stitch. And I'm just going to slip stitch that hip curve to the pleats. And I'll see you back when I'm done. Hi gang, welcome back to the studio. So after an hour or so of sewing, I now have the body of a gown. And that's what the inside should look like. See, with all the pleats just hanging out there. And that's literally all they do in extant gowns from the 18th century. The pleats just hang out inside, being salvagey. A lot of gowns, they don't even cut them off. So what I'm going to do next is prep a sleeve for a quick fitting, because I drafted the sleeve for Jenny after she had gone back to Nova Scotia. And I just want to double check before I cut into the good fabric, how the sleeve fits on her actual body. I know kind of how it'll fit, but I just want to double check. And it's always good to double check. Factory cotton is cheap. So I will do that this evening. And tomorrow when we come back, I will show you how to set a sleeve and put some shoulder straps on. And then it'll just be down to decoration. So likely one more day of sewing, and then decoration, decoration, and more decoration. I'm thinking some pink pleated ruffles for the robings, and maybe down the fronts, and gonna buff them up a little bit so they look a little less new. And then I might polonaise this skirt. I haven't quite decided yet whether or not she's going to get a short gown or it's going to be a polonaised gown. There's enough length in the hem to be either at this point. We'll just see how it works on her. Anyway, we'll take a crack at this again tomorrow morning when there's light. It's now time for barn chores.